And welcome back to another episode of TWiP Weddings. Once again, my name is Bruce Clark, and I am joined, as always, by my co-hosts, Mr. Brian Caparici and Mr. Robert Evans. Good day, gentlemen.
Good day, eh?
Good day, eh?
Beautiful. We're turning Robert into a Canadian. Perfect.
To my Canadian friends.
Perfect. All we need is you just need to have your Timmy Hortons coffee and start watching hockey, and you'll be all set.
I am watching hockey.
Ah, excellent. Right on. Who's your team?
Well, I guess it would have to be the Wild.
The Wild? Yep. Nice. Good stuff. Well, we didn't bring you on this week to talk about hockey. We're going to talk about a different topic. This week we decided we're going to talk about making the transition to full-time. So I think a lot of photographers, wedding photographers, probably start their careers by, as a side job, or maybe it's a side hobby that grows into a business, and maybe they work another job while they're doing wedding photography, and then eventually reach a stage in their career where they have to make the decision if they're going to transition and go full-time with their wedding photography. So we're going to dive into that topic this week. But before we do, we want to remind you how you can participate in the show. We've got several different ways to interact with us. First off, you can visit the website at thisweekinphoto.com. There you'll find our show and all the other great shows on the TWiP network, and you'll find show notes for each episode, and we'll put links in there to everything we talk about on the show. If you have a question or a suggestion for a topic that we could talk about in a future episode, just email us at twipwed@thisweekinphoto.com. Or if you like to use social media, just use the hashtag TWIPWed, and we'll keep our eye out for those posts as well. And probably the best place to keep up with us and where there's a lot of activity is head on over to our Facebook group. And there you'll see lots of great discussions happening. People are asking questions and interacting with each other. So head on over to our Facebook group and join if you're not already a member. So let's jump into the show, and I thought this week would be a good time to talk about kind of making that leap, making that transition from possibly being part-time and doing wedding photography as a side occupation to actually jumping in with both feet and doing it as a full-time profession. And is that necessary? Do you have to go full-time to be a good wedding photographer or to be considered a professional wedding photographer? So that's kind of the topic we're going to dig into this week. So I wanted to talk to both of you guys and find out, so I think Robert, you've always been, like, photography has kind of been your thing, right? Like, you kind of went into it full-time, or did you do something else in addition to photography?
Well, I think my path was probably a little different than most today in that I started out working for a studio and eventually worked for 3 different studios before starting my own business. So I got into weddings by accident, I guess. I started when I was 18, 19, and of course I didn't want to shoot weddings. That wasn't my thought. And that's what was there, and that's sort of what happened, and I'm glad that I did. But to make a very long story short, I worked for 3 different studios. Worked for one where I started, went to the second one where I was one of 5 photographers, to the last one where I managed the wedding department for 2 locations, and then started my own business in January of '94. So it's a little bit different path, I think, than a lot of people today, because a lot of people, like you mentioned, start off with an interest in photography, then maybe start shooting some, interested in weddings, and maybe they assist before they shoot, which I recommend. Mm-hmm. And then they start. So yeah, my path was kind of a little bit different, but I think my overall opinion on this topic, 27 years later, and going through a lot of change in the wedding industry, would be, if that's definitely what you want to do, make sure you make that transition when it's right. Although I am kind of a fan, of someone, if you do have some sort of job and you could do it, on the side, and I guess you don't want to overcommit to, so both jobs get not your full attention, but I think it can be done if you have some sort of side job, accountant, whatever it is that you do. I think or if you have of course, a spouse or someone that has a very good job, and you can yourself then spend time, making that your full-time job.
Yeah. Brian, what was your path? Did you jump into photography both feet full-time right out of the gate, or did you do something else and then photography kind of was something you did on the side?
I was actually a student as I started into my career as a photographer, and so it's, I guess, perhaps a little bit non-conventional. I've actually never really run my photography business part-time, unless you count the first year when I was still in university, starting my photography business. I was running it part-time then, but I actually ended up stopping my university degree to pursue photography full-time because my it was doing so well for me that school for me was a distraction. It wasn't. I had to pick one or the other. I was kind of at that point where I either had to transition into being a photographer full time or keep going to school and kind of slow down the photography business. And I made the decision to go into photography, and it's 10 years later now, and I'm happy I made that decision. So for me, that's always been the case. I've always been fortunate enough to have the drive and determination to work hard to make the full-time thing work, and it's always been that way for me. But I don't think that has to be the case for everyone. I think there's a lot of photographers that I know personally in the area locally that are doing a great job balancing both. I just think that I don't think you can expect to run two full-time things. You can't have a full 9 to 5 and expect to run a full-time photography business. You got to kind of like even out the scales at some point, perhaps at the beginning, because I coach a lot of photographers that are in that transition of going from a full-time job into photography.
Yeah, so you probably get the question a lot, like,
Yeah,
when do I make
yeah.
the leap? And
And that's the thing. I mean, I think at some point, at the beginning anyways, if you're just getting into photography, to abandon your 9 to 5, if there's not flexibility to go into full-time photography, it's a pretty risky thing. Entrepreneurship is a high risk. It's always a high risk. Running a small business for yourself is always a high risk, and photography added onto that because of the saturated market is, in my opinion, an even higher risk. And not that I'm trying to scare anybody, but I definitely wouldn't recommend just going cold turkey on it, because I think that's a really dangerous place to be, especially if you are dependent on the income. If it's different, where it's like Robert was saying, where you have someone in the family that your husband, your wife, or whatever, if you have someone else that is making the income that you need to live off of, then that is maybe a different circumstance. But if you are relying on your income as as a income provider for your family, don't try to make the transition without some time and some well thought out process for it. So I think, at some point when you start, you're going to be doing your 9 to 5, working your 40 hours a week at your day job, and you're going to be doing photography on the side. And I think the best situation that I've seen a lot of photographers do is where they take their 9 to 5 and they scale it down as they scale their photography up. So it's kind of like a teeter-totter where they're doing it slowly over time, and they're doing it in a way that is less risky, and it's a little bit more calculated, so they have the time to move into it. That's the ideal situation in my mind, but obviously not everyone can do that.
Yeah, it depends on what job you're in and stuff. I had the luxury of I did that for a little while.
Right.
Particularly, I had a job that was fairly. I'd been there for a long time, so they wanted to keep me around and they wanted to keep me happy. So they were willing to kind of be a bit more flexible. And one of the things in our industry was that over the summer, it actually was a bit slower. It was a bit quieter. And so what I was able to negotiate was during the summer months, from basically May until the end of September. I was able to negotiate a 3-day work week. So I only worked at that job Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, which left me Mondays and Fridays to focus on the photography side of things, which was great because Fridays, it opened me up so I could shoot some weddings on Fridays, or just get prepared and get ready for weddings on Saturdays. And then I had the Mondays to work on, the editing and the culling and stuff, so I didn't feel as overwhelmed as if I was still trying to fit in 40 hours. So I like your suggestion of if you're in a job that lets you kind of manage both things. I have a lot of photographer friends here that actually work in the healthcare field, and they're nurses. And great occupation because they can kind of pick up shifts when things are slower. Right. And then when things are busier, like in the summer, they can scale back a little bit, and they only have to maintain a certain number of hours, and there's always demand. Like, they always have a lot of shifts that they can pick up, so it's not hard for them to go back and forth. So certain careers and certain jobs kind of lend themselves to that kind of job flexibility.
Well, I even wonder, like, something that an exercise that I've helped a lot of photographers in coaching do is the process of really looking at what is the lifestyle that you're trying to live, and what do you need in order to maintain that. A lot of the times we could just kind of work our job, not really knowing what our needs are, like what is that we're trying to do, and perhaps if you're going to sacrifice something, maybe it's that, you know, if you look at what your expenses are and how much money you need to be making in order to live the lifestyle you want to have, maybe in this transition you've got to sacrifice some of those things. Maybe you can't be going on 2 vacations a year. Maybe you can't be going out for dinner once a week. Maybe you've got to make some sacrifices here and there. Maybe you can't get that brand new computer or get that car or whatever it is. But maybe that's the sacrifice that you need to make in order to decrease how much money you have to make, and therefore you can transition quicker into photography. That's another way to look at it as well.
Yeah. So Robert, you mentioned your path kind of was a lot different back in the day. Do you think that the way you kind of entered the photography business and got into it, do you think that that's still a possibility out there, or do you think that door is kind of closed for a lot of newer photographers that are just kind of getting into the market? Do you think there's much opportunity? And Brian, same question for you as well.
I mean, I think there is. I think it becomes like a catch-22 for people in that, you know, like we've all heard, like, well, I don't want to train my competition, but there is the catch-22. I mean, I think if it's done right, you know, I had photographers that worked for me, and one in particular that worked for me for a good 7 or 8 years. Of course, naturally went out on his own, but he did it ethically and in the right way. And to this day, you know, I send him referrals. To this day, he still is the one that will travel with me on a lot of my destination stuff because he likes to travel. You know, he you know, has his own business, but as well as like he'll assist too when he's open. So it actually works out really well. So again, I think ethically, if you do it the right way and you have the right intentions, you know, and that maybe is just the communication in the beginning. If you're talking to a studio and you're like, hey, look, I want to do this. Eventually, I'd like to have my own business, but I'm willing to give you 3 years or 2 years. Or I think that's an ideal way, an apprenticeship. I mean, I definitely learned, you know, everything to start running my business. I mean, basically, the last studio that I worked for, when I managed the wedding department, it was like running my own business. The owner of that company just had a wedding department. It was primarily a portrait studio, and I had all the decisions. I basically did everything of running my own business for, you know, about 2.5 or about 2 years, except for being responsible for paying the bills for the albums and the lab and things like that. So it made my transition very easy. So I think it's a really nice way to go in and learn, you know, how to run a studio, learn customer care, you know, learn some of those things. You know, for the 3 studios that I worked for, I learned, you know, I took little bits and pieces along the way. So I think ultimately, to sum it up, yes, it's a viable way to do it. You have to find the right studio, the right match, and just, you know, be honest with your employer if that are your intentions. Or maybe you change your mind along the way. You get into wedding photography and you're like, wow, I kind of really like this. And you're like, you know, hey, Mr. Boss, I'm really liking this, and I'd love to maybe give you another year or 2, but I'd like to go out on my own. You know, maybe we can work that way. So if you're working for the right person, and I think you communicated, it can be done.
Yeah, because being a photographer doesn't necessarily mean that everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, right, Brian? Like it's not guaranteed that just because you want to be, maybe you really love wedding photography, but maybe you absolutely like hate the business end of it, and you don't. That's not something that's you don't have a calling to be an entrepreneur. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, I think actually it's funny because I was going to go into that exact sort of whole concept of, I think it's automatically assumed today that if you want to be a photographer, you start a photography business. At least, you know, in the wedding and portrait space, that's typically what a photographer does. But I think that in doing that, a lot of photographers miss the idea that running a photography business is being an entrepreneur. It's so much more than just taking pretty pictures.
Yeah.
We've dedicated how many episodes now here on this podcast? I've got 200 episodes on my podcast. There's hours and hours and days and weeks of education about the business of photography. It's more than just taking nice pictures. So don't make the mistake of falling in love with the creativity of being a photographer to automatically mean that you want to start a business. And I think in that process, it's totally okay to say, hey, I just want to be a photographer. I just want to take nice pictures and be able to make a living doing that, there are plenty of ways that you can do so without having to take the burden of being an entrepreneur. You can go work for another photographer. You could be, we talked in a previous episode when we talked about second shooters. You could be like a second shooter for hire, that you just like, all you do is just offer your services up to other photographers to hire you out to be their second shooter. What a great way. If you want to be a photographer and just take pictures without the risk and the struggles of client communication and the billing and everything
Marketing
that goes along with it, everything.
Yeah.
I mean, running a photography business, I say all the time that it's 20% photography and 80% business. If you don't have any interest in that 80% of business, then don't try to get into business, you know? So I think that that's totally fine. Like, go work for another studio and just find a great flow there. Maybe you can kind of have a bit of an entrepreneurial input there, and maybe you can kind of, if you get in with the owner, you can kind of give some advice and say, hey, I have this cool marketing idea, I have this, but the burden isn't yours. You know, you can just be the photographer and just kind of do like a 5% business thing on the side to help out. So yeah, I think at the same time, I also think that there's a lot to be said for getting that experience in photographing for another photographer and with another photographer. I see it all the time when it's like, you know, it's going to actually probably happen, I guess, depending on when this episode airs, right after Christmas time is when everyone gets their new shiny SLRs, like the consumers get their SLRs. They take a few pictures over the holidays, and someone says that they look better than the pictures you take with an iPhone, and all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should be a photographer. And then they just go and start being a photographer.
That seems like easy money.
That seems like easy money, right? But, you know, the process of getting in, there can't be enough said about learning the fundamentals of photography and learning through experience, apprenticing with somebody else, mentoring with somebody else, learning the ropes, and building your portfolio in your skill set. I don't think you can say enough about that. So I think regardless of whether you want to be an entrepreneur or just a photographer, I think you should go get under somebody else's wing for a couple of years either way.
So I want to ask Robert, so if that's a great suggestion, and I think it's awesome, how would somebody go about doing that? If, let's say, you're in that position, you think you want to pursue photography, what would your advice be, Robert, in terms of approaching? Because I know a lot of photographers, the vast majority of them are solopreneurs, right? They're just a single person. Maybe they're a husband and wife team, but they're not a big formal studio with lots of staff, and like those kind of studios, there's not very many of those around anymore. At least not where I live, there's very few of those. So how do you go about approaching a photographer and saying, I'd like to work for you? Because sometimes they're barely trying to, keep their heads above water, let alone bring somebody else on. So what would your advice be in terms of, finding somebody to mentor and work with?
Yeah, I think you find someone, I think maybe that you respect their work and that you like. That always helps, that you kind of gravitate. You're like, I want to be like that person. I really admire their work. Now that they may be a completely different person, you may find out you don't want to work for them, but that's all part of the experience. And then of course, the simple part is just asking and inquiring. I think there are some photographers that are standoffish and they think people want to steal and take from them, but you have to be willing to work for free too, I think. Like, put yourself out there and say, look, I really admire your work. I like what you do. I'm willing to come to weddings with you and carry your bags. Even just the few times, if it's just, I'll carry your bags at 2 or 3 weddings. I'll just watch and observe. I won't take any photos. But eventually, this is my goal, and this is what I'd like to do. Of course, over the years, I've gotten many of those requests as well. And a lot of times, I would be open to anyone. It didn't always work out because of schedule or whatever, but I would ask, what I would do is I'd have that person come along as a third photographer. So it would be myself, my second that I was always worked with and comfortable with. And then I'd let that person come along as a third, and I would tell them, I want to see what you see. And it didn't matter the amount of experience that they had, or if they had a ton of it or a lack of it. It didn't matter. I wanted to see what they see. I give them a little bit of guidelines. I said, we're telling a story, emotion. I want to see that. I want to see what your vision of a wedding day looks like, and then we'll review those pictures afterwards. And it's an interesting experience because I get people that would come to me with a lot of experience, and kind of a cocky attitude, and they were usually the worst photographers. And then I'd get people that would come to me that had like literally like a meager portfolio that was almost laughable, but really liked the person, and you're like, wow, good for you, you got some chutzpah, and you're out here wanting to do it, so come along. And I let them shoot, and you're like, wow, like they definitely have potential, like this person has an eye and they see it and they get it. So I think, if you're the photographer thinking about bringing a person on, you have to kind of have that attitude, like sort of be a little open to it. And if you're the photographer wanting to do that, you go out there and give it your all and work hard. And, I think it's like one of those things, just like an intern or a PA in the movie industry or whatever, like you have to pay your dues. And there is a huge sense of entitlement in this world right now, I think, especially with the youth. I know I sound like my parents, but
kids these days.
Kids these days.
But you have to do whatever it takes. And if your photographer is like, go get me a coffee or a water or whatever, you do it with a good attitude and a smile, and you're like, here you go, and you do it the best. If you're the water boy or girl, then you're the best water boy or girl that photographer's ever seen.
Yeah.
I think that attitude goes a long, long way and will get you privileges, better than, having attitude and thinking that you're too good to do something like that.
Yeah, and I think an important thing, if you're going to approach other photographers, you have to look at, what needs can you help them with? Maybe they're good in particular. Maybe they've been a great photographer. They've been around for a number of years. Maybe they're not very well versed in something like social media or blogging or these kinds of things, right? Yeah. So maybe if you're approaching them, you can say, look, I'm newer in the photography world, but I've got all this experience in X, graphic design, or whatever it might be, right? That maybe
I think social media is a great example. That's like a great path for someone to be like, hey, I'm great at social media, but I also want to learn to shoot. I'll do your social media. Let me come shoot with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of almost an exchange of services, but helping, like, what can you bring to the table to kind of help them, right, as a way to kind of get in the door to kind of help.
Yeah.
So Brian, I want to ask you you probably get this question a lot. From people you probably see, in terms of just, again, we don't have any hard statistics, but what do you see in terms of rates of business failure? Like, of people that go out there and say, yeah, I want to become a wedding photographer, a portrait photographer, they start their own business. What do you see? What do you think if you had to guess, what do you think the failure rate is?
Gosh,
in terms of like being able to sustain yourself from it and earn a full-time living?
Well, I guess for those listeners that are listening that don't want to get discouraged, just press the fast forward 30-second button.
Skip to the end.
What I might share with you now might scare you a little bit. But no, I mean, I think if I look back 10 years ago, like the photographers that I knew and was associating myself with 10 years ago, and I look at who's still around today, let's say that there were 50 of them back then, I maybe can count on one hand how many of them are still around.
Wow.
Today. And that being said, in the photographers that I've seen over the years through PPOC or through teaching or through networking or coaching, whatever it is, the success rate isn't great. But I think if I were to put a number to it, maybe 20% will actually succeed past 5 years, maybe less than that.
Yep.
Do you guys think that number is high or low?
It's probably accurate. Could you sum up, Brian, like in a short? I know this is a longer answer, but
are you asking me for a short answer, Robert?
Right. Why the 20% are still around, and then why have the rest of them? What mistakes? So as a learning experience to our listeners.
Yeah, I think one of the things. I mean, I know that I say this all the time, but it's. I think intention has a ton to do with it. I think going into being a photographer, understanding what's going to be involved. I think a lot of us get into it, like I said earlier, with like the sort of rose-colored glasses, and we're sort of looking at it as like, oh, I can take pretty pictures and make $1,000 on one wedding day. That sounds wonderful, and then you kind of get into it, and it's just like, holy cow, that's not what it is. And so I think that is kind of the first time a photographer will get knocked down when they realize this isn't what I was expecting. And then on top of that, in order to be sustainable, you've got to have those sound business practices. I know I probably sound like a broken record talking about business, but for me, I really do truly believe that you can be a decent photographer with amazing business skills and last much longer than a great photographer with crappy business skills.
Agreed.
And so I think that having a good foundation in the business side of being a photographer is what will take you from being able to make a go at it for 1 or 2 years to actually being able to do it in the long term. Because at the end of the day, when you sort of announce to the world that you're a photographer, right? You put it on your Facebook page, people start to see you, and maybe you get a little bit involved with some local community things. Anyone can drum up business for a year, just based on their own internal circles, based on the little network that they can create with their friends, their family, people that they know personally. But if you want to have A, those people come back to you, so have repeat business. If you want to B, have those people refer you, and then C, reach a much wider audience so that you can have a sustainable business model, there's no way to do that without having sound business fundamentals. And I think that is where most photographers fail, not because they're not good photographers, but because they don't have the business fundamentals down.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of making this, we kind of circle back to the topic of making the transition to full time. What are some things? What are some strategies and some things that they need to keep in mind when they're trying to make that decision? Like maybe they've been at it for a little while and things are going okay, and you get to that stage where you think, okay, maybe I can make this what I do now for a living, and maybe it's because of the lifestyle that you want to live, or because that's what you love and you hate the other thing that you're doing and you really want to pursue it full time. What are some, I guess, tipping points or some things that can, kind of help you make that switch over?
Robert, you want to take this?
Thanks. Robert, you're siloning, so can you pop out and come back in again? Just so that your audio is gone all...
Am I still?
Yeah.
Okay.
The joys of podcasting live.
I think
we should keep this in because this is us raw and uncut.
Yeah, raw and uncut.
Okay, so Bruce, sorry, can you re-ask the question there?
Sure. So again, making that transition. So say you're doing something, you're working another job full time, and you're doing photography on the side right now as a part-time thing. What are some of the factors that go into making that decision? That okay, now is like, how do you know when is the time? I know it's going to differ for everybody and their circumstances and stuff, but what are some of the big factors that you think are key in terms of making that decision?
Well, I think that the very idea of just asking that question is probably one of the most important things that you can do in the transition into being a photographer, because I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with a photographer and I'll say, oh, so are you going full time? And they'll say something to the extent of, oh, I'm just not there yet. And it's like, well, what is there? Like, define there, right? If you never really, it's the age-old thing. If you never know where you're going, how are you going to know when you're there? And so I think at least having some level of understanding of what is it you're trying to achieve? What are your goals? What are your milestones? What is it that you could achieve that would make you feel as though you're there? And then I think we need to break those down into sort of steps that are achievable. If you say something like, well, I'll be able to go full-time in photography once I can make an income of $80,000 from photography. Okay, well, that is a very tangible way to look at it, and I think the whole concept of, it's called SMART goals. I think it's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. I think that's the way that it goes, something like that. So if you can have a SMART goal, something that you can actually work towards, and then break that down into pieces, it's going to be different for everybody. But I think income and financials have to be part of it. You have to at least know what you need to be making as an income from photography. But then outside of that, I think you could look at things like lifestyle. Like, for example, if you're a new mom and you just had a baby, maybe now isn't the best time to try and transition into being a full-time photographer, because you're going to be busy at home. There's going to be a lot of distraction. There's going to be a lot of things going on in your life, and it maybe just isn't the right time for you to transition into being a full-time photographer. Or maybe now is the best time to transition into it because you have your EI, you've got some support, and you have some free time. But whatever it is, I think that financial is a big part of it, and then lifestyle is a big part of it. You have to know when is the right time for you to transition. And then also, kind of, I guess, related to lifestyle is like, what are your family dynamics? Like if you are a wife and your husband is going through a big transition at his work, maybe his income is going to be dropping for the next year while they transition to their work. Maybe now isn't the best time for you to be risking something like that. Whereas maybe your husband just got a big bonus check and now is a great time for you to be transitioning. So I think those kinds of things you really have to look at. But I think at the end of the day, asking the question, when is the right time and what are the conditions that surround the right time? I think that's a question that you have to ask yourself that most photographers probably don't ask themselves.
Yeah, I know in the startup world they talk a lot about runway. Right, you want to make sure that you've got enough runway, right? To using the plane analogy, right? If you're going to take off, you got to make sure that you've got enough runway so that you don't run out of, a tarmac before your plane gets off the ground. So I think when you're making that, that decision, you're looking at things. Obviously, you mentioned the financial, right? You need to take a look at what do I need to earn, or what are my, the next 6 months or 5 months. To get off the ground, to get my business, because in those first probably 6 months to a year, you might not make a lot of money, so if you're just kind of starting out, and you probably have a lot of expenses as well when you're first starting up your business. There's going to be a lot of things that you need to worry about, like getting legal fees and website up and running, and accounting fees and incorporation fees and all these. There's lots of expenses that happen, so you want to make sure that you've got enough runway. There's people that maybe sort of make this knee-jerk reaction and say, oh yeah, I hate my job, I'm just going to do photography, and they quit, and then they go, oh crap, I've only got a month worth of savings in the bank, and I can't make a go of it. Robert, let's see, is your sound better? Let's see if you're less silent.
How do I sound?
Take us to your leader. You're still very very silent-y.
That's weird.
The microphone gods are not smiling upon you today.
I'm muted. I unmuted.
Maybe try switching to your other mic. It might sound at least better. Might not sound as good. We might not have your soulful tones, but it won't be silent-y.
We'll lose the Barry White, but we'll also lose the Terminator.
The Terminator, yes, yeah.
What about Zencaster?
Change it on there too, if you can.
Okay, let's see.
I think, Bruce, just to comment on that, I think something that I've always sort of paid a lot of attention to is, everyone has this amount of money in their bank account that they feel comfortable with having, and they don't really want to get below that amount, right? Everyone kind of has that number, whatever that number is. It's like as soon as it gets below that number, we start to fret, and if it's above it, we feel okay. I think that it's important to, when looking at that number and when kind of evaluating what that is in your head, I love the idea of runway, and it's definitely something that I pay a lot of attention to because we're in the startup world here at Sprout. I think we should have 6 months worth of expenses in the account in case something were ever to happen. Mm-hmm. So whatever your monthly expenses for your business, now in that, consider things like ongoing, like your prints and your albums and those kinds of things, your overhead and your rent and your utilities, equipment, education, anything that you have for an expense in your business, whatever that number is per month. Let's just say for sake of argument right now it's $5,000 a month. I think that you should have 6 months of that in your account at all points of time, and that way if business were to drop down, photography is very seasonal, so if you realize now that business is down, if you want to ramp things up, you may not see the results of that for another 6 months because you may not have those weddings or that income coming in until then. So I think you should have that money sitting in an account so that you always have it just in case. And maybe when you get to that point, that's a good indication that it's safe to come full-time into it. If you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants and going paycheck to paycheck, it's probably not the best time to be going into a risky venture like being an entrepreneur.
Yeah. So Robert, you're sounding better. I think we got rid of the silencing, so that's good.
Yeah, I switched to the other mic, but then Zencaster stopped, so I don't know how you control that without killing the whole thing.
Oh, well, that's technical stuff. We'll figure that out. If it's still, just go back into Zencaster and.
Yeah, looks like he's in there. It's good to go, I think.
Looks like you're good. So, and I wanted to ask you about Robert, kind of. Some of your suggestions as far as if you're going to go full-time, what are some of the pros and what are some of the cons to say you wanted to keep your part-time job and then work? What are some of the pros and the cons to that?
Well, you kind of touched on it before in that you said well, what if you don't like your current situation? And I think that's, viable. Like if you don't like what you're doing, then you may want to leave and go full time. I'm kind of a fan, just from hearing stories and people in today's world of, if you can do both, why not? I mean, I guess if it got to the point, where it was so lucrative that you couldn't, say no, well, then I get that. But if you could do both, like I'm a fan of like doing both. If it works for you, you enjoy it, you're happy, then do both. I think, probably one reason somebody would make the jump to full time is it just makes them happier. And maybe it is more lucrative than what they were doing. It all depends on what your previous life and job is. So I mean, the pros and cons of you are your own boss, and that's great. You set your own schedule. You sleep as late or get up as early as you want. You have no one telling you what to do. For some people, that's great. For some people, that's bad. They need
that
to
can be a con for some people. Yeah.
Right. They need to be told what to do.
Yeah.
And then I think, of course, we talk about the business part of it, but there is, especially within I know wedding photography, there's always cash flow because we have seasons. And so managing that cash flow and being able to deal with it is a whole other thing, because we've all been there, and it's certainly not fun when the cash isn't flowing. Of course, it's great when the cash is flowing, but when the cash isn't flowing, it can be challenging, and that's when you put yourself in a position where you might think about discounting what your normal rate is, because you need that deposit just to pay your rent that month or whatever the case is. So Brian's point of like having a nice cushion to fall back on certainly helps you to say no, if you will. In other words, you're having a slow cash flow month and a job comes along, you want to say no to it because you want to, stick to your standards. I mean, you got to use common sense, but, you have the ability to do that for a little while. So, that's a very good business habit, is just, have that savings so that you're like, okay, well, I'm good for a little bit, and, there's all a bunch of ups and downs in business. So, I mean, you have a job, and if you have a job, then there's always consistency, and you know what your paycheck is every week. But that doesn't mean your job's going to be there next week. I mean, the way the world is, things change. Whole industries go out of business because of technology. So you have to evaluate what your position is and what you do, and is your, paying 9-to-5 steady job always going to be steady?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we covered a lot of stuff, but I think Brian had something to add to that, but we'll kind of bring it around and kind of try and wrap it up. But I wanted to ask you guys just real quick, lightning round, 1 or 2 tips, advice for people who are making that transition into full-time. What are some of the things you learned from your experience that you could,
I think something that I would love to sort of embark, and it's something I've written a lot about, the idea of comparison. And I think it's really fitting for this, because oftentimes we get into this place when we're building our photography business and we are comparing what we're doing with what everybody else is doing, without necessarily getting context into what everybody else is actually doing. There's this great quote that I love to use, and it says something to the extent of, don't compare your behind the scenes with everybody else's highlight reel. Mm-hmm. And you can easily look at your competition, listen to podcasts by us, look at people up on stage at the trade shows, and say, oh, well, they're charging this much for a wedding, and therefore I should be getting close to that, or why am I not there, or whatever the case is. If you're just getting started in photography, you're at a completely different point of your career as many other photographers are. So don't try and use what they're doing as a point of comparison to what you're doing. And I think that we need to stay focused on what we're doing and what makes most sense for us. I know you said lightning round, Bruce. Sorry, this isn't.
That's
really,
good. This is Brian's version of a lightning round.
Yeah, if I talk for less than 2 minutes, that's
Yeah, then it's
technically
a
a
lightning
lightning round for me. But I think it's so important because it's so easy to get caught up, especially with social media, especially when we're kind of like really when you go to a networking event and you talk with another photographer, most of the time, if you say, "Oh, hey, how are things going?" They're not going to say things like, "Oh man, I'm not getting the business I want. I'm not getting the calls. I'm not converting people. I'm not happy with my work creatively." They're not going to say things like that. They're going to try and pump up whatever is going well in their life.
Mhm.
And yet we compare that with what we know of ourselves and our insecurities and everything that we aren't happy with. And so I just think my one sort of tip to close my thought out on this is to say, just worry about you. Worry about what makes sense for you. Worry about how you're improving. And the only thing you should be comparing yourself to is yourself from last week. And if you can just grow week over week over week, then I think you're going in a good direction.
Yeah. Good advice. Robert, what would you if you could
I
give some
really like
advice?
that too. And then I would just say I think certainly you have to want it bad enough and want it more than anything you've ever wanted before, and you have to work with the mindset that way, and you have to don't worry about being told no, and just keep putting one foot in front of the other and make it happen, because it's not going to happen overnight, but those little steps, one foot in front of the other over a period of time, well, then you can look back on your path and see where you've come and where you are and where you want to go.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think good advice all around. Excellent. Well, I think hopefully that gave people some things, food for thought, things to think about if you're in that situation where you're thinking about making that transition from part-time to full-time, or maybe maybe it gives you some food for thought to think, well, hey, maybe I'm okay staying with this job over here and doing photography part-time. Again, there's no one right way of doing it. We've all got different experiences in terms of how we went to full-time with our businesses and transitioned into things. I think we all came at it from different approaches, so there's no one right way, but hopefully we've given you some good advice and some things to think about anyway if you are kind of in that state with your photography and thinking about taking it to that next level of maybe going full-time with it. So excellent stuff.
Can I close out with one final thought on that?
Absolutely.
Because I can just see photographers listening to what we've said over the last 40 minutes or so and perhaps feel overwhelmed, but also feel like oh my gosh, there's all these things I have to think about. Brian, Robert, Bruce, you guys gave us all these ideas and stuff, and I guess I want to remind the photographers listening that the idea of done is better than perfect, in the sense that it's so easy to get into a space where we obsessively analyze everything, and we almost do that to the point of actually never actually doing anything. And I don't want photographers to get into a space where they just don't act because they're obsessively thinking about things and trying to perfect them.
Yeah.
Action is the cure for procrastination, so just act and get in and do something. And maybe it's not going to be perfect, but you'll learn from your mistakes. And I think that you'll learn more from your mistakes than you will by trying to perfect something the first time.
Nice. So we'll insert the Shia LaBeouf, just do it clip, right? We'll just put that in here. So just get out there and do it, right?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, some good advice. Let's move on then. We'll answer a quick listener question because I know we've skipped the last couple episodes, so let's get to a listener question this week. We've got a question that came to us through our Facebook group, and it's from Miroslav Selek. I hope I pronounced your last name properly. I am a wedding/event photographer, and I'm looking for a new computer. Currently, I own a PC with one 27-inch monitor. It's not a Pro monitor. I'm debating a switch to a 27-inch 5K iMac. What are your thoughts? First off, do either of you have the 5K or the new 5K iMac?
Nope.
No.
Okay, good. Neither do I. I've eyed it up, but I've seen it. I've gone to the Apple Store and looked
They're
at it.
super sexy.
They are very nice, yeah.
Yes.
What would I guess maybe not necessarily that model. I mean, obviously, yeah, I'd say, yeah, if you're looking at that, that's probably the best Mac to go with right now. But what would your advice in terms of making the transition from PC to Mac be? Have either of you guys made that move?
I was by a computer for a while because I used to run QuickBooks on a PC when QuickBooks back in the day stopped making the upgrade for Apple. and then they came back, of course. I enjoy my Mac, so I don't have a ton of PC experience. I would say, there's going to be a learning curve, but I think maybe some growing pains. But once you do it, you're going to love it. And we all know what PC stands for.
Brian?
I've never heard that, what PC stands for. That's amazing. I'm going to be using that in the office here. All of our developers use Windows machines, so that's perfect. Okay, so my answer is not straightforward, like usual. My recommendation for both Miroslav and for anyone looking at doing a transition in machines is don't do it. And the reason that I say don't do it is because I think oftentimes we distract ourselves with shiny new object syndrome without actually thinking about why we're trying to do it. And I think it's so easy to say, if you were to look at two things and say, well, I could grow myself as a photographer and maybe go to a workshop and spend $1,000 and I would learn a lot about photography and grow as a creative, or there's this shiny new computer that came out. Which should I do? And I think that we get into this. We've talked about gear acquisition syndrome a few times here on the podcast. I think it's something that we are frequently going into, that sort of state of mind of always wanting the next thing, always wanting bigger and better. And I mean, certainly I think that if you are finding that you are actually limited with your current equipment, whether that's a computer or a camera, whatever it is, if you're actually limited, and it's slowing you down and stopping you from doing what you need to be doing, then yes, upgrade, do it. And I think that Mac that he's talking about is a perfectly good upgrade. But I would also just encourage Miroslav and anyone listening to think about, do I actually need it, or am I using it as a distraction from actually doing what I should be doing?
Yeah, that would be my thing. Is like, what's wrong with your current setup? Is it just old and aging and time to replace? Which we all know that happens with computers, right? Yep. You need to replace them every so often, right, to keep up with technology and changes. I mean, I think these days it's a lot easier if you want to make that flip between PC and Mac. So much now is web-based. It really, a lot of applications that you're running are web-based, so it doesn't really matter whether you're on a Mac or PC. A lot of the hardware devices, hard drives, printers, they're all compatible with both systems. And most of the major software that you use, like Office and your Adobe Creative Cloud and stuff like that, that's all cross-platform and whatnot. So I think these days it's not as much of an issue whether you go PC. I did just recently install Windows 10 on a Parallels machine. And I'm pretty impressed with it. It's actually not bad. It's because I have one application that is an accounting application that only runs on Windows. So I had to have some sort of operating system. So I just run it in Parallels, and it works great. And I'm actually looking at Windows 10. I'm like, it's not bad. Yeah. It's not horrible. I mean, it's not. So far I've seen it's been pretty good. So I think Windows has done some Microsoft's done some interesting things. So yeah. So hopefully that answers Miroslav's question. Again, if you have a question for us, just head on over to thisweekinphoto.com. You can leave it in the comments, or if you want to email us, just send an email to twipwed@thisweekinphoto.com, or like Miroslav did, post up a question in our Facebook group, and we'll take a look for those and answer them. All right, so before we close things off, we want to just share our picks of the week. And each episode, we will share a photography-related item that we think would be a benefit to wedding photographers. It can be anything, as long as it's somehow related to photography, and sometimes we stretch it. So we'll see. What have we got this week? Who's got a pick ready to go?
I'll go.
Okay.
This is kind of a follow-up to some of our previous episodes when we did Inbox Zero. There's a new, which I'm just trying out, but I'm liking it. It's called Sandbox, and it will attach to any of your emails, and it has a lot of features built in where it automatically weeds out spam, of course, and you can send stuff to what they call a black hole, and it will learn it and unsubscribe you from it automatically. It has the recall where you can say, bring this back to my inbox later. It recognizes everything that's important to you. So I'm doing the free trial right now, but so far it's really nice. And anything for me to just gain control over my email.
That's Sanebox, right?
Sanebox, SANEBOX, sanebox.com.
Excellent, good pick. Brian, what do you got for us this week?
Okay, I'm totally cheating and using my pick from, I was on on TWiP the other night, and I used this as my
Don't
pick.
tell people. Just
Well, but it's I just have to make them aware that I know that I'm cheating, but it's so good that I want all of our listeners to benefit from this as well. It is an app called JPEG Mini Pro.
Ooh,
Have you guys heard of JPEG Mini Pro?
I've heard of it.
Oh, it's amazing. So what it is it's an app that's on your desktop computer. They also have plugins for Lightroom and for Photoshop. And basically it takes a JPEG as an input, and then it outputs a JPEG. But in the process of taking the JPEG in and doing its magic with it and then spitting it out, it reduces the file size by like 4 to 5 times, which is remarkable, and there is no degradation of image quality, which is phenomenal. So I'm able to get, and this is great for online galleries, for when you're doing your portfolio on your website, for when you're blogging, for social media. It keeps the file size down without losing image quality. So I'm able to get a 2 to 3 megabyte image down to like 800 kilobytes.
Oh wow! So that helps with page
it's
speed
like
and
big time, because at the end of the day, if your website, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter how great your imagery is, if it takes a long time to load, people are going to click away. So if you can use a tool like JPEG Mini Pro to save that much time in page loads, it's a huge benefit to us.
Very cool.
Yeah, so JPEG Mini Pro.
JPEG Mini Pro. Again, we'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode.
Cool.
Well, my pick this week is a book. I'm actually currently listening to it as an audiobook, and it's called The Pumpkin Plan. Have either of you guys heard this?
I have, yep.
Book?
Yeah.
So it's by Mike Michalowicz. I think I pronounced his name correctly. And it's basically he looked at, as an example, farmers that were their main goal was to grow the biggest pumpkin they possibly could. They're in these pumpkin I guess this is a thing. I didn't know until I read this book. This is a thing. They're in these pumpkin competitions, and they want to grow the world's largest pumpkins. And so he actually took a look at that and formulated kind of a business approach based around the strategies that these farmers use to grow the big pumpkins. And he talks a lot about, they go in and they weed out the small pumpkins. And so you can imagine, just sort of take that to a business standpoint, and you can imagine kind of where he goes with it. So it's a really great business book, and it talks all about about being focused on one thing, about eliminating the weeds, or sort of the things that are keeping you from growing that big pumpkin in your business. And that big pumpkin, might be, say you decided you're a wedding photographer and you want to do all high-end, Grace Ormond type weddings. That might be your pumpkin you're going after. And so to get to that big pumpkin, you need to start eliminating some of the weeds and things that are taking you away from getting at that main goal. So it's a really good business book. I'm only about halfway through it right now. But so far it's pretty interesting. So it's called The Pumpkin Plan. And if you go to pumpkinplan.com, you'll see it there. So if you guys, either of you read this book?
You're listening to it on audiobook?
Oh, yes, I am.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so I kind of have it on in the background. So
that's a great way. I mean, those that are listening to us right now, obviously you enjoy consuming content through audio form because you're listening to our voices on a podcast, which is an audio form. So like audiobooks are a great way to get education, much like podcasts are a great way to kind of get a passive form of education, but in a way that is still meaningful and you can get great value out of it. So. Yep. This podcast sponsored by Audible.com. No, it's not. But I think Audible and audiobooks are a great way of consuming education.
Yeah, and my pick from a few weeks ago was a library card, like get a local through your local library. And our library has arrangements, and you can get free audiobooks and ebooks. So a lot of these business type books are actually available to take out from your local library or through as an audiobook. So
good call.
And it's free.
Yeah, so good call.
It's pretty cool. So that's another way you can consume some great business content.
Cool.
Awesome. Good picks this week, guys. And I think we had good discussion. So that's going to bring us to the end of another episode of TWiP Weddings. I want to thank our sponsors for their support and remind you, send in your questions and comments for the show and share your thoughts and join up our Facebook group. So what's everybody up to over the next little while, and where can our audience go to keep up with everybody? Mr. Evans.
I'm up to go do a shoot, so I'm going to jump out of here. But if you want to find me at Robert Evans, Instagram and Twitter, robertevans.com is my website, and Robert Evans Studios is my Facebook page. And of course, come engage with us on our TWiP Web Facebook page.
Nice. I think I'm going to get Robert a new microphone for Christmas. I think the Cylon is returned again, so hopefully we'll banish the Terminator by by the next show. Brian, how about you? What have you got coming up? And
Cool. Yeah. So I had the pleasure of, in the last episode, we talked about the Redefine Busy series that I'm writing and going through right now, as well as talking about Sprout Studio. And so we're kind of deep in that Redefine Busy movement that we're creating, helping photographers gain more control of their life, take back their time, and get better balance. And so I'd love photographers listening to come join us on that. It's just a free series over on our blog. If you go to redefinebusy.com, it'll redirect you over to the articles. Other than that, all of my writing in my own podcast about the business of photography is over at sproutingphotographer.com. And if you're interested in Sprout Studio, which is what we talked about in the last episode, which is the industry's first all-in-one platform, you can visit getsproutstudio.com.
Awesome. Good stuff. And again, if you're looking for me, I'm at Bruce Clark, with an E at the end of Clark, on most of the social networks. So if you just Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff. And if you're looking for my website, it's momentsindigital.com. And you'll find the blog and kind of everything that we've been up to recently. So there you go. So that's how you can find us on the grand interwebs. So I guess that brings us to another episode, at the end of another episode. So be sure to visit our website at thisweekinphoto.com. And thanks again for listening to TWiP Weddings, raising the bar one wedding at a time.